The GPS died 12 miles back, right where the gravel logging route split into two overgrown deer paths. I didn't need the satellite navigation anyway. The directions on the clipboard clipped to my dashboard were written in my supervisor's aggressive, blocky handwriting. Keep driving north until the trees look burned, then look up. I slowed my beat-up Ford Ranger to a crawl, the tires crunching over dry pine needles and pulverized volcanic rock. Out here, deep within the Klamath National Forest in southwestern Oregon, the air always carried the sharp, resinous tang of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. But as I crossed the dry creek bed marked by a rusted metal sign, Deep Creek, the scent shifted. It turned bitter, stale, like the acrid leftover haze of a campfire doused with stagnant river water. 1 year ago, the Deep Creek fire swept through the sector. The Forest Service official report called it a lightning strike, but the locals down in Klamath Falls still whisper about it over cheap diner coffee. They claimed there were no storm clouds that night in July. No thunder, no dry lightning. Just a sudden, blinding flash of white heat that scorched 3,000 acres in under an hour, then abruptly extinguished itself at the edge of an ancient grove of coastal redwoods and sequoias. I shifted the truck into low gear and began the steep, winding ascent up Pilot Knob. Through the dusty windshield, the burned sector revealed itself. Miles of blackened, limbless trunks stood like charred spearheads thrust into gray earth. Yet, strangely, the forest floor wasn't dead. Wild brush and pale, sickly ferns were already choking the dirt, growing back with frantic, unnatural density. At the summit stood Tower 4. It was an old air motor steel lookout, built back in the 1950s, towering 80 feet above the granite outcrop. The cab at the top, a glass-walled box barely 14 by 14 feet, was meant to be my home, my workplace, and my solitary cell for the next 3 months. I cut the engine. The silence hit me first, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. I was a fire lookout. Silence was part of the job description. After the chaos of my life in Eugene, the failed thesis, the suffocating noise of the city, the endless drone of voices, I want to forget. This isolation was precisely what I begged for. I stepped out of the cab, stretched my aching back, and breathed in the cool mountain air. The wind was blowing hard off the Cascades, snapping the flag on the lookout rail. I could hear the familiar sounds of Pacific Northwest wilderness, the creak of swaying timber, the distant, frantic tapping of a pileated woodpecker against the dead fir, and the low, hollow rush of the wind through the canyon below. Everything seemed completely normal. I spent the next 3 hours hauling my gear up the open great steel stairs. Fuel cans, dry rations, water jugs, my laptop, and my pride and joy, a rack of high-fidelity bioacoustic recording gear. Aside from fire spotting, my secondary contract with the Oregon Department of Forestry was to monitor wildlife recovery in the burn scar using long-range directional microphones and ultrasound hydrophones. By 6 p.m., I had the cab set up. The Osborne Firefinder, a large, circular brass map instrument used to pinpoint smoke columns, sat dead center in the room. Around it, my monitors glowed softly, displaying real-time audio waveforms captured by the 4 directional microphones I'd calibrated around the tower's perimeter. I slipped on my studio headphones, adjusted the gain knob, and listened. The headphones came alive with the vibrant, textured symphony of the Klamath wilderness. To the north, the sharp chickadee-dee of a mountain chickadee. To the west, the rhythmic rustle of a mule deer pushing through the dry brush. The forest was breathing, alive, vibrant. Then I turned the pan dial toward the south, toward the Deep Creek Basin, where the ancient sequoias stood. The sound didn't just fade. It dropped off a cliff. I frowned, tapping the audio interface. The signal level for microphone 3 hadn't dipped. The meter was active, registering ambient sound pressure, but what was coming to the ear cups was wrong. It wasn't the quiet of a forest at rest. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. In audio engineering, even an anechoic chamber, a room designed to absorb 99.9% of sound reflections, has an ambient profile. You hear the air moving, the low hum of your own nervous system, the faint rustle of your clothes. But this soundscape was flatline. When the wind blew from the south, I could see the tops of the massive sequoias swaying violently through my binoculars, their branches whipping against one another. Yet my microphone, aimed directly at them, picked up nothing. No wood creaking, no needles rustling, no air tearing through canopy. It was as if the wind entered that specific pocket of the woods, surrendered its sound, and moved on in complete unnatural silence. I pulled off the headphones, rubbing my ears. A faint, prickling sensation spread across the back of my neck, the kind of subtle instinct that tells you a storm is rolling in over the horizon. I looked out through the glass walls toward Deep Creek. The afternoon sun was dipping low, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the blackened valley. Down in the basin, surrounded by the scorched earth, the ancient sequoia stood tall, dark, and motionless. The sun rose red over the ridge, filtered through a high haze of dust and distant smoke. I had barely slept. Every time I had slipped into a drift of half-dreams, the silence on microphone 3 would drag me awake, pulling my eyes toward the glowing green meters on my audio deck. At 7 a.m., I packed my canvas rucksack with a handheld directional mic, an acoustic spectrum analyzer, 2 liters of water, and my satellite phone. The rules for fire lookouts were clear. Stay in a cab during daylight hours unless cleared by dispatch. But when I radioed district operations in Klamath Falls to report the audio dead zone, all I got back to the speaker was a burst of harsh, crackling static, followed by a faint, rhythmic clicking, like fingernails tapping rapidly on a wooden desk. District, this is lookout for, copy? I called out, thumbing the mic button, experiencing heavy static interference on channel 1, moving to ground level to inspect perimeter sensor array. Over. Silence. Not even the static held a steady frequency. It seemed to rise and fall in time with my own breathing. I strapped my radio to my belt, grabbed my gear, and descended the 80 feet of open great steel stairs. The morning air was crisp, but down on the forest floor, the wind had completely died down. My boots crunched loudly against the granite gravel, each step echoing through the burnt timber like a small firecracker. I walked south, following the dry bed of Deep Creek toward the border where the fire had stopped. As I crossed from the charred pine saplings into the shadows of the ancient sequoias, the ambient sound began to warp. It didn't happen all at once. First, the high frequencies disappeared. The crunch of dry twigs under my soles lost its sharp snap, turning into a dull, thudding vibration that felt trapped inside my ankles. Next went the mid-range, the sigh of the canopy, the hum of insects in the brush. By the time I stood beneath the first giant sequoia, a massive, copper-bark titan nearly 20 feet wide at the base, my world had turned entirely mute. I clapped my hands together hard. Nothing. I saw my palms collide, felt the sting of impact in my muscles, but no sound reached my ears. Not a pop, not an echo, not even a faint rustle of my sleeves sliding against my jacket. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the shock wave. The pressure in my eardrum spiked instantly, a tight, nauseating fullness similar to diving into deep, cold water. I swallowed hard, trying to pop my ears, but the sensation remained. Panicked for a second, I reached into my throat and shouted. I felt my vocal cords vibrate violently against my collarbone, my lungs working hard to push the breath out. But out in the open air, my voice was swallowed whole before it could leave my lips. Focus, Maya, I told myself, forced to rely entirely on the internal monologue inside my skull. Is an acoustic dampening effect, a localized atmospheric phenomenon. I pulled out my portable spectrum analyzer and switched on the handheld directional mic. The digital display flickered to life. The audio meter wasn't sitting at 0. In fact, it was pinned to the far right in the red zone. The microphone was picking up a massive acoustic payload. It just wasn't the range of human hearing. The display showed a colossal, uniform spike down at 4 Hz. Infrasound, extreme low-frequency vibrations. Infrasound at high sound pressure levels is known to cause severe physiological effects in humans. Vertigo, nausea, intense dread, and a strange resonance in the human eyeball that creates visual hallucinations. Tigers use it to paralyze prey. Earthquakes generated before the crust snaps. Whatever was producing this 4 Hz frequency was flooding the entire grove, overwhelming the air molecules so completely that no higher frequency sound waves like my voice or a snapping twig could form. I moved deeper into the grove, following the analyzer's signal strength meter. The massive sequoias towered above me like the pillars of a flooded cathedral, their deep orange bark scarred with ancient fire marks. But down around their bases, something new was growing. Spreading across the carpet of damp pine needles was a web of thick, fibrous tendrils. They looked like tree roots, but they were ivory white, threaded with faint, translucent veins. It was mycelium, the underground root network of fungi, but expanded on a monstrous scale. The tendrils pulsated almost imperceptibly, rhythmically contracting and expanding like a million tiny lungs buried in the dirt. Then I saw the truck. It was a heavy-duty Dodge Ram dually, painted forest green with the faded logo of a private timber company on the door. It was parked sideways in a clearing, its driver's side door flung wide open. The front bumper was wrapped around the trunk of a young fir tree, as if it had crashed at low speed. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on the bear spray holster at my hip. The truck was empty, but the bed was loaded with heavy gear. Chainsaws, gas cans, steel cables, and industrial winches. A crew of wildcat loggers, poachers who illegally harvested high-value old-growth timber from protected federal land. On the ground next to the open driver's door lay a heavy steel chainsaw. Its guide bar was pinched halfway through the trunk of a massive sequoia. Dark, sap-stained with chips were scattered everywhere. I knelt by the chainsaw. The pull cord was snapped off. On the metal body of the saw, smeared in grease and sawdust, were 3 distinct bloody fingerprints. I stood up and scanned the silent forest. Hello? I tried to call out, though I knew no sound would come. A few feet away, partially hidden beneath a dense mat of white fungal tendrils, lay a hard hat. I kicked it aside with my boot. Beneath, it was a pair of heavy work gloves. They weren't empty. They were still attached to the cuffs of a flannel shirt, which stretched out through the brush toward a shallow depression in the soil. I took a step closer, my stomach dropping into a cold abyss. The clothes belonged to a man, but the man was no longer inside them in any way that made sense. The flannel shirt was torn open down the center, pushing up through his rib cage, winding through his shirt sleeves, and coiling around his jawline was a dense, matted weave of white mycelium and fibrous wood rootlets. His mouth was open in a silent, wide-eyed scream, but his throat wasn't filled with blood or dirt. Glittering in the dim light beneath his shattered jaw, his tongue had been completely replaced by a smooth, polished knot of solid sequoia heartwood. I stumbled backward, my boots tangling in the white tendrils that laced the forest floor. The horror didn't make a sound. When my elbows hit the dirt and my breath blew out in a hard, terrified gasp, the silence swallowed it instantly. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently it felt like it would shatter them. I didn't look back at the logger's body. I ran. My eyes darted across the silent grove as I bolted back toward the dry bed of Deep Creek. The world around me felt like a muted film played at breakneck speed. Giant sequoias blurred past, their massive, dark trunks standing like silent sentinels watching my escape. With every stride, the pressure inside my skull worsened. The 4 Hz infrasound wave pulsed through my body, vibrating my internal organs, making my stomach churn with a deep, primal nausea. It wasn't just in the air. I could feel it rising through the soles of my boots. The ground itself was shivering, a low, rhythmic hum carried to the dense web of white mycelium buried beneath the topsoil. I broke through the edge of the ancient grove and crossed back into the scorched burn scar. Pop! The sound returned, so suddenly it felt like a slap across the face. My own ragged breathing, the harsh rustle of my windbreaker, The crunch of gravel beneath my boots. All of it rushed back into my ears in a disorienting flood. I fell against a charred snag, gasping for air, tears of sheer panic burning in my eyes. I reached up and pressed my fingers against my neck, feeling the rapid, frantic flutter of my pulse. I could hear myself. I could hear the wind again, whistling through the dead, limbless firs. I pulled out my portable spectrum analyzer and pointed the directional mic back toward the grove. My breath hitched. The edge of the infrasound wave wasn't stationary. On the digital screen, the red spike at 4 Hz was creeping forward, expanding outward from the Deep Creek Basin like a stain spreading on paper. It was moving at a slow, deliberate pace, maybe 2 feet every minute, advancing toward Pilot Knob, toward Tower 4. The fungal network beneath the trees wasn't just absorbing sound. It was growing, radiating out from where the loggers had wounded the ancient sequoia. I grabbed my satellite phone from my pack, my fingers slick with cold sweat. I dialed the emergency dispatch line for the Forest Service headquarters in Eugene. The line connected. District operations. State your emergency. A woman's voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and mundane. This is Maya. Look out 4 on Pilot Knob. I shouted into the mic, my voice high and breathless. I have a fatality at the Deep Creek sector. A wildcat logger. He's dead. There's something wrong with the timber down here. Some kind of biological contamination or fungal outbreak. I need a medical examiner and an evacuation team immediately. Do you copy? There was a pause on the line. For 3 sweet seconds, I thought help was coming. Then the dispatcher's voice shifted. The crisp tone dissolved into a flat, unnatural monotone, as if she were reading words off a screen she didn't understand. Look out for... Remain at your post. The trees must not be disturbed. What? I stuttered, stepping backward. Who is this? Get me the forest supervisor. The silence is healthy, Maya. The voice returned, but it wasn't just coming from the phone speaker anymore. A sharp, high-pitched pitch shifted down through the line, dropping octave by octave until it hit that same gut-churning 4 Hz hum. The phone in my hand grew burning hot. On the screen, the caller ID numbers glitched, scrambling into a string of repeating zeros. I dropped the phone into the dirt. It lay there, its tiny speaker vibrating against the dry soil, emitting a low, wet clicking sound. Click, 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 like with splintering under immense pressure. Panic took over completely. I turned and sprinted up the steep, winding trail toward Tower 4. By the time I reached the base of the Steel Lookout, the sun was high in the sky, beating down with dry, relentless heat. The 80 feet of open great stairs looked longer than they ever had before. I grabbed the handrail and began hauling myself up, step after step, my calves burning, my eyes fixed on a glass cab above. When I reached the top platform, I burst through the trapdoor and slammed it shut, throwing the heavy brass latch into place. Inside the cab, my audio equipment was going berserk. The green and red LED meters on the rack were dancing frantically. The radio console was broadcasting a continuous stream of white noise mixed with that rhythmic, wood-splintering clicking. I rushed to the center of the room, grabbing my binoculars from the ledge next to the Osborne firefinder. I raised the lenses to my eyes and trained them on the access road at the base of Pilot Knob. A second vehicle was down there, parked half in the ditch near the Deep Creek Bridge. It was a white Forest Service pickup. The driver's side door was open, swinging gently in the light breeze. Through the optics, I could see 2 figures standing near the rear bumper. They wore the green trousers and beige shirts of forestry field technicians. Hey! I screamed through the glass, even though they were a mile away. Hey! Up here! I focused the binoculars on the 2 technicians. They weren't looking up at the tower. They were standing side by side, perfectly still, facing the wall of ancient sequoias across the creek. As I watched, one of the technicians slowly raised his hand. He wasn't waving. He was reaching out toward his partner's face. He didn't touch him. Instead, he pressed 2 fingers firmly into his own ear canal, pushing hard, his shoulder tensing with the effort until blood trickled out between his knuckles. The second technician didn't move, didn't react, didn't even turn his head. Both of them stood there in the dust, completely paralyzed, as a thin, brilliant white mist began to rise from the dry creek bed beneath their boots, a cloud of microscopic fungal spores, floating upward like steam from an open grave. I backed away from the window, dropping the binoculars. A quiet thud echoed from beneath my feet. I froze, looking down at the wooden floorboards of the cab. Thud, thud. Something was coming up the steel legs of the tower. I crept toward the center hatch, my hand resting on the heavy fire axe secured to the wall rack. I leaned down, pressing my ear near the gap in the floorboards. The metallic ring of the steel framework was changing. The steel legs of the tower groaned, a dull, deadened shudder that traveled straight up into the soles of my boots. I gripped the handle of the fire axe, my knuckles white, staring down at the brass latch on the floor trapdoor. Through the gaps in the iron grate platform outside, I saw them. They weren't climbing like animals or men. White, roped tendrils of mycelium were winding around the tubular steel legs of Tower 4, creeping upward at a terrifying speed. They coiled over cross braces, binding the steel joints, swallowing the rust and paint under a thick, pale pelt of living fiber. Where the roots touched the metal, the wind whistle died instantly. The tower stopped ringing in the gale. It became heavy, silent, deadened. Clang. A single heavy thud struck the trapdoor from below. I raised the axe over my shoulder, taking a ragged step back. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice sounded hollow in the small glass room. "I'm armed." The trapdoor didn't burst open. Instead, a series of pale, needle-thin rootlets pushed through the hair-thin gap between the wood hatch and the steel frame. They flared like tiny white fingers, tasting the air, then began to thicken rapidly, fusing the trapdoor to the floor with a sticky, sap-like resin. They weren't trying to break in. They were sealing me inside. I lunged forward, swinging the fire axe down with all my weight. The heavy steel blade slammed into the trapdoor, severing a dozen tendrils. The axe blade made no sound as it struck, no loud thunk of iron on oak. The impact was entirely visual, a silent spray of pale pulp and dark, viscous sap that splashed across my boots. The sap smelled intensely of ancient earth, wet iron and raw, rotting sugar. I pulled the axe back for a second strike, but the tendrils surged into the freshwood wound, knitting together like living stitches, sealing the crack faster than I could hack at it. Within 10 seconds, the hatch was completely buried under a smooth, matted white knot. Panicked, I spun around to look out the glass walls. The dead zone had swallowed the summit of Pilot Knob. Looking out over the 4-foot-high wooden sill, I saw the white mist rising from the tree line below, spilling over the granite boulders like heavy, dry ice fog. It swept across the open dirt clearing surrounding the base of the tower. Inside the cloud, the 2 forestry technicians from the road were walking up the access trail. Their movements were horrifyingly wrong, jerky, mechanical, like marionettes pulled by tangled strings. The blood on the first man's shirt had dried black around his collar, but he wasn't looking at the ground. His head was tilted all the way back, his throat stretched taut, his mouth locked wide open in an unnatural O shape. From inside his open throat, a small bundle of pale white tendrils extended outward, swaying softly in the air like marine anemones feeding in an ocean current. Beside him, the female technician walked with her hands limp at her sides. Her eyes were milky white, the lenses completely covered by a thin, crystalline film of fungal growth. She carried a heavy brass pipe wrench, holding it by the very tip of the handle. They reached the base of the tower and stopped directly beneath my floor. I pressed my face against the thick glass pane, staring down. "David, Karen," I yelled, recognizing their badges through the optics of my binoculars lying on the chart table. "Can you hear me?" They didn't look up. They didn't have to. The female technician raised a heavy pipe wrench and struck the steel leg of the tower. Nothing, no metallic ring echoed up the frame, but the vibrations surged up the steel. The 4 hertz pulse spiked so hard that the glass windows of the cab shuddered in their wooden frames. A sudden, sharp pain stabbed behind my left eyeball. My vision blurred, doubling for a terrifying second. I dropped the axe, grabbing my temples as a wave of intense vertigo knocked me to my knees. The room tilted. The Osborne firefinder in the center of the cabin seemed to warp, its brass rings stretching into long, grotesque ovals. Infrasound poisoning. At this proximity and sound pressure level, the vibration was beginning to match the natural resonant frequency of my human organs. My heart was struggling to keep its rhythm against the overwhelming external pulse. I crawled across the linoleum floor toward my audio deck. The green and red meters were turned solid red now, lit up like a Christmas tree, completely saturated by the invisible sonic wall surrounding the tower. I reached up, grabbed the heavy master volume knob on my amplifier, and turned it all the way to the right. I grabbed a pair of industrial noise-canceling earmuffs, the heavy lead-line ones used for working near helicopter rotors, and slammed them over my ears. Then, I grabbed the microphone for the tower's public address horn, a massive 100-watt directional loudspeaker mounted on the underside of the cab roof, pointing straight down at the clearing. I flipped the toggle switch from rec to pass-through. If the fungal network was using a 4 Hz wave to dominate the medium of the air, I was going to fight back with brute force acoustic resonance. I plugged a portable signal generator into the AUX input, set the dial to 1000 Hz, a sharp, piercing, ear-splitting sine wave pulse, and hit the red emit button. I didn't hear the horn blow through my lead-line earmuffs, but I felt it. The floorboards violently shuddered as 100 watts of raw, high-frequency audio blasted downward to the floor, slicing directly into the silent mist below. Through the glass, I saw the effect instantly. The two technicians collapsed as if their spinal cords had been cut simultaneously. They hit the dirt in a heap, writhing frantically, their hands clapping over their wooden-clogged throats. The white mist around the base of the tower vibrated violently, scattering outward like dust blown by a jet engine. The white tendrils coiling up the steel legs turned brown, shriveling and weeping clear liquid as a high-frequency sound wave tore through their cellular structure. I gasped, a small spark of hope reigniting in my chest. It works. Sound breaks their signal. I stepped toward the glass, holding the microphone tight, ready to ramp up the gain. Then, down in the Deep Creek Basin, something responded. It wasn't a sound. It was an answer. A massive, subterranean shockwave hit the mountain. The bedrock beneath Pilot Knob groaned. Down in the valley, the ancient, towering sequoias didn't sway. They vibrated so fast their outlines turned into a green blur. The glass didn't shatter outward with a loud crash. It imploded inward in absolute, terrifying silence. Thick, heavy panes of reinforced glass burst into thousands of sharp, glittering diamonds that rained over the linoleum floor, catching the harsh midday sun. A wall of air hit me like a physical fist, a dense, heavy wave of pressure that knocked me flat on my back. My lead-lined earmuffs were torn from my head, skittering uselessly across the broken glass into the corner. I lay on my back, gasping, staring up at the roof of the cab. The wind off the Cascades was blowing furiously through the empty window frames, whipping my hair across my face, snapping my maps off the wall. But I couldn't hear a single thing. The gales of Pilot Knob had been completely silenced. The air inside the room felt thick, oily, and ice-cold, smelling overpowering of crushed wood, ancient mold and raw, copper-like iron. I tried to sit up, but the world spun violently. My vision was completely distorted. The extreme infrasound pressure was vibrating my eyeballs inside their sockets. Everything I looked at had a shimmering, oily halo around it. The straight wooden edges of my desk appeared to curve like water. The steel legs of Firefinder distorted into grotesque, serpentine shapes. Get up, Maya. Get up. I forced myself onto my hands and knees, my palms slicing directly into the sharp glass shards littering the floor. I didn't feel the pain. The intense vibration pulsing through my central nervous system had numbed my nerve endings, turning every sensation into a dull, distant thud. I looked up toward the southern window frame. The white mist wasn't just floating around the base of the tower anymore. Driven by that massive subterranean pulse from the Deep Creek Basin, it was rising at the height of the lookout like steam from a boiling cauldron. Thick, billowy plumes of microscopic pale spores poured over broken windowsills, pooling onto the floorboards like heavy white fog. Where the mist touched my skin, on my bare wrists, my neck, the cuts of my hands, it felt unnaturally cold, like prickles of liquid nitrogen. I scrambled backward on my knees until my spine hit the central chart table. I grabbed my canvas rucksack from under the desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the zipper. I dumped the contents onto the floor. My second canteen of water, a roll of duct tape, my leatherwork gloves, and my spare P100 industrial respirator mask. The kind meant for fine particulate matter and ash hazards. I grabbed the P100 mask and slammed it over my mouth and nose, pulling the rubber straps tight behind my skull until the silicone seal dug hard into my cheeks. I took a breath. The dual pink filter cartridges clicked as the valves opened. The air inside the mask was warm, stale, and tasted of rubber, but it was clean. The thick, sweet smell of the spores faded instantly. At least I can't breathe them in, I thought, pulling my leather gloves over my bleeding palms. As long as the filters hold, they can't seed inside my lungs. I grabbed my roll of duct tape, tearing off long, sticky strips with my teeth. I wrapped my wrists where my sleeves met my gloves, sealing the skin. I wrapped my ankles, binding my heavy hiking boots tightly to my jeans. I pulled my windbreaker hood high over my head and taped it down around the rim of my respirator mask until not a single square inch of skin was exposed to the open air. I was sealed inside my own makeshift hazard suit. Through the broken window frame, a shadow fell over the room. I looked up, gripping the edge of the chart table. It was Karen, the female forestry technician. She hadn't climbed the steel stairs. The thick, white roped tendrils of mycelium had wrapped around her waist and legs like a living harness, hauling her lifeless body up the outside of the steel framework. She was suspended outside the southern window, swaying gently in the silent mountain wind like a corpse on a gallows. Her eyes were gone, replaced by two smooth, bulging clusters of pale fungal caps that glistened in the sunlight. Her mouth was stretched open so wide that the skin at the corners of her lips had torn. She raised her arm. The movement was stiff, accompanied by the wet, sickening crunch of snapping tendons inside her elbow. Her hand reached into the room through the broken glass, pointing her index finger straight at my face. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Instead, from deep inside her exposed, spore-clogged throat, a single, thick, ivory-white rootlet pushed out past her teeth. It unfurled like a blooming flower, its tip splitting into four tiny, delicate palps that vibrated rapidly in the air. Click. The sound didn't travel through the air in my ears. It resonated straight through the bones of my skull. A sharp, rhythmic tapping that echoed inside my jawline, matching the rhythm of my panicked heartbeat. Click, click, click. She was calling to the network, locating the last source of heat and movement inside the tower. Behind her, down in the clearing below, the rest of the forest was changing. Through the white haze, I saw the scorched trees at the edge of the burn scar beginning to move. They weren't falling over. The charred, blackened trunks were leaning inward toward Pilot Knob, their dead, limbless tops bending at impossible angles, as if the entire mountain were pulling itself inward toward a single, massive heart buried deep beneath the granite roots of Deep Creek. The white tendrils covering the floor of my cab suddenly twitched. They stopped creeping slowly. All at once, hundreds of pale, fibrous roots erupted through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, reaching upward like a forest of pale, skeletal hands, wrapping around the legs of my desk, my chairs, and my boots. The white tendrils snapped around my ankles like living wire, pulling hard. My left boot slammed against the linoleum floor as I was yanked toward the gaping hole where the trapdoor had been. The roots were thick, slick with that foul, sweet-smelling resin, coiling up my duct-tape jeans toward my knees. I didn't think. I drove the heavy steel head of the fire axe straight down between my boots. The blade sliced through the matted root mass with a dull, suppressed crunch. Sap sprayed across my rubber P100 mask, blinding my left eye in a smear of milky amber. I kicked my leg free, tearing a strip of duct tape right off my ankle, and scrambled backward toward the shattered northern windowsill. There was no going down the stairs. The 80-foot steel framework below was no longer a ladder. It was a solid, towering pillar of pale, fibrous wood, entirely wrapped in a pulsating sheath of white mycelium. Karen's suspended body hung just feet away from the southern frame, her throat rootlet vibrating frantically, driving that sharp, bone-deep click-click-click straight into my teeth. I turned to the northern window, Directly below the cab on this side, the granite cliff face of Pilot Knob dropped sharply into a steep, scree-covered slope. 30 feet down, the thick canopy of a surviving grove of mountain hemlock offered the only break in the rock. It was a suicidal jump. But staying in the glass box meant letting my throat become another planter for the thing beneath the mountain. I hoisted myself onto the narrow wooden window sill, glass shards crunching under my heavy boots. I looked down into the swirling sea of white spore mist. The air below looked thick as wool. I took one deep, rag breath through my rubber filter mask, gripped the handle of the fire axe tight in my right hand, and pushed off into the silent void. For 2 terrifying seconds, gravity took everything. The wind rushed past my ears, completely mute, a ghostly gale that carried no roar, no whistle, no sound at all. I fell through the blinding white mist like a stone dropped into a milk bucket. The world turned entirely featureless. A blank canvas of freezing cold humidity that coated my hood and visor in microscopic frost. Brack! The impact was brutal. I smashed through the top of the hemlock canopy. Heavy, needle-laden branches slammed into my chest, my face, my shoulders, whipping against my limbs, tearing my windbreaker, ripping the axe from my grip. The wood gave way under my weight, breaking my fall frame by frame, branch by branch, until I crashed hips first onto the steep, gravelly slope below. I tumbled down the scree, sliding through loose granite dust and sharp volcanic slag, before finally slamming hard against a massive, exposed root knee of an ancient fir tree. I lay there in the dirt, pinned flat, staring up at the white sky. My right shoulder felt like it had been struck by a sledgehammer. Every rib burned with a hot, stabbing agony that made breathing through the rubber respirator feel like inhaling crushed glass. My left eye was still partially blinded by the sap smear on my visor. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, listening to the agonizingly loud, wet rattle of my own breath trapped inside the silicon cup of my mask. I survived the drop. I raised a hand, wincing as pain shot to my collarbone, and wiped my visor with the back of my leather glove. The fog around me was dense, restricting visibility to barely 10 feet. I was on the northern flank of Pilot Knob, wedged into a shallow ravine that drained down toward the upper fork of Deep Creek. The tower above was hidden entirely by the mist, but I could feel it, a massive, rhythmic thudding vibrating to the granite bedrock against my spine. Thud, thud, thud. The 4 hertz infrasound pulse was stronger down here on the ground. It was no longer just an invisible wave in the air. It was moving the earth. Small pebbles on the scree slope were jumping in place, dancing like water droplets on a hot skillet. I dragged myself up onto my knees, clutching my injured arm against my ribs. My fire axe was gone, buried somewhere in the brush above. All I had left was a gear strapped directly to my body. My taped-up clothes, my P100 mask, the canteen on my belt, and my leather-work gloves. I looked around the ravine floor. The forest here hadn't been burned by the fire, but it was dead nonetheless. The Douglas firs stood tall and straight, but their needles were a dull, oxidized copper, completely dead on the stem. Down in the damp soil of the ravine bed, the white mycelium network wasn't just a web of roots. It had built structures. Rising from the mud like pale, fleshy stalagmites were dozens of hollow, trumpet-shaped fungal towers, each about 3 feet tall. They were made of the same dense, ivory white with fiber, their open tops flaring outward like the bells of brass horns. The white spore mist was pouring out of them in steady, rhythmic puffs, synchronized perfectly with the deep, subterranean thud beneath the mountain. They were acoustic vents, biological subwoofers, amplifying the infrasound wave and distributing it across the valley floor. As I watched, frozen in terror, the vent closest to me twitched. Its flared lip expanded, the pail was stretching like wet leather, and turned 6 inches to the left, orienting its open bell directly toward where I knelt in the dirt. The white trumpet vent twitched again, its leather-like ivory lip flaring wide as it oriented its open bell straight toward my chest. A silent ripple passed through the air, a sudden, violent spike in pressure that slammed into my faceplate. My vision shuddered violently. A fresh jet of blood welled up from my left nostril, hot and thick, pooling inside the silicon cup of my rubber P100 mask. It coated the inner exhalation valve with sticky, dark film, Every time I breathed out, the rubber valve fluttered with a wet, struggling rattle. I forced myself up from the granite scree, clutching my broken right shoulder against my ribs. The mountain was waking up, its subterranean heartbeat driving the 4 hertz infrasound pulse through the rock with relentless, crushing force. All around me, down the narrow, fog-choked floor of the ravine, dozens of the pale fungal horns were flexing. They rose from the mud like a field of blind, fleshy serpents, their flared muzzles twisting toward the sound of my ragged, bloody breathing. I had to get out of the ravine. I had to move down valley, away from Pilot Knob, toward the old logging road that led out of the Klamath Basin. I took a stiff, staggering step forward. My boot came down on a dry fir branch. Snap! The sound was tiny, muffled by the dense spore fog, but to the network beneath my feet, it was a beacon. The vent 6 feet away didn't emit a sound. It erupted with an acoustic shockwave. The air between us compressed so fast it looked like a ripple of clear glass bending the light. The concussive pulse hit my legs, knocking my knees out from under me. I hit the mud hard, my left arm plunging elbow deep into a cold, jelly-like mass of white mycelium. The moment my bare glove touched the root mass, a sharp, cold-burning sensation shot up my forearm. I scrambled backward, tearing my hand free. Thick, thread-like filaments of white fungus were clinging to the leather of my glove, wriggling like tiny, pale worms, trying to find an opening, a tear, a seam in the duct tape sealing my wrist. They don't hunt by sight, I realized, my mind racing through the haze of concussion and pain. They hunt by acoustic reflection. They feel the vibrations in the air and the ground. I sat frozen in the mud, holding my breath inside the rubber mask. The vent above me swayed slowly from side to side, its pale wood bell questing through the mist like an animal sniffing the wind. 3 feet away, a second vent tilted down, its open throat dripping with clear, thick amber resin. I didn't move a muscle. I stopped gasping. I held the stale, bloody air trapped in my lungs until my chest burned like liquid fire. Slowly, agonizingly, the vent's tension eased. Its flared rim relaxed, drooping back toward the mud. I have to be silent. Totally, completely silent. I dragged myself up, keeping my weight distributed evenly, sliding my boots through the damp soil instead of lifting them and planting them down. I moved like a ghost through the pale, dead ravine, stepping over the writhing webs of white roots, weaving between the fleshy trumpet vents that lined the creek bed. The fog grew thicker as I descended deeper into the basin. The air inside, my P1 under mask was getting heavier. The pink filter cartridges mounted on my cheeks, meant to trap dust, not a dense, living biological fog, were clogging. Every time I inhaled, the rubber mask sucked tight against my nose and mouth, collapsing inward. The microscopic white spores were coating the outer fiberglass mesh of the filters, building up a thick, felt-like crust of white mold that blocked the airflow. I'm suffocating inside my own suit. My vision began to narrow, dark spots blooming at the edges of my sight as oxygen deprivation set in. Sweat poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes, pooling around the silicon seal at my chin. Through the murky haze ahead, a massive shape loomed out of forest. It wasn't a tree. It was a structure. It was the ruins of the old Deep Creek Maintenance Station, a corrugated tin and timber barn built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s, long abandoned and half-collapsed under decades of heavy mountain snow. Its heavy oak door was hanging wide open, swinging silently on a single rusted iron hinge. If I could reach the barn, if I could seal myself inside an airtight space away from the open air, I could tear off these clogged filters and breathe. I quickened my pace, sliding my boots faster through the mud. 5 yards from the threshold, my foot caught on something hard buried beneath a carpet of white roots. I tripped, sprawling forward onto the rotting timber porch of the barn. My knee slammed hard into the deck boards. The wooden planks groaned, a sharp, hollow creak that echoed to the silent clearing like a gunshot. Instantly, from inside the dark interior of the barn, came a response. It wasn't the air pulse of a vent. It was a heavy, rhythmic crunch of heavy work boots walking across shattered glass and dry wood, stepping out from the darkness toward the open door. End of section 7. The footsteps stopped right at the threshold, just inside the deep shadow cast by the barn's tin roof. I lay flat on the rotting porch planks, my heart pounding so hard against my ribs I was terrified the vibration would give me away. I held my breath, the clogged pink filters on my P100 mask whistling faintly as my lungs screamed for oxygen. Blood from my nose was pooling in my chin cup, warm and metallic. A hand reached out from the darkness and gripped the doorframe. It was a human hand, or it had been once. The skin was a dull, waxy ash gray, stretched so tightly over the bones that the knuckles looked ready to burst through. But it wasn't just skin anymore. Threading through the tendons of the wrist, weaving under the fingernails like delicate lace, were thick, pale strands of ivory mycelium. The fingernails themselves had dropped off, replaced by smooth, polished caps of dark sequoia heartwood. The figure stepped out into the dim, fog-filtered light of the porch. He wore a faded blue denim jacket with a torn Forest Service patch on the shoulder. His name tag was still pinned over his breast pocket. Miller. Miller had been the chief ranger for the Deep Creek District during the 1980s. The man who signed my grandfather's historical inspection reports. The man who vanished 40 years ago when the uranium mines were abruptly sealed. He hadn't aged a day, but he was far from alive. His jaw was gone. In its place, a massive, bulbous mass of white fungal tissue had erupted from his lower face, fusing his chin directly to his collarbone. Pushing up through his empty eye sockets were two smooth, pale trumpet horns, miniature versions of the acoustic vents lining the ravine. They twitched silently, turning in unison like radar dishes tracking an invisible target. He didn't walk like a man. He moved like a puppet being dragged across the floorboards by invisible wires attached to his shoulders. Don't move. Don't breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut behind my visor, pressing my body flat into the rotting oak planks. Miller stepped right over me. One of his heavy mud-caked boots came down 6 inches from my head. I could smell him, an overpowering, suffocating odor of wet peat, ozone, and old, stagnant blood. From inside his hollow chest came a low, wet clicking sound, click, 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 resembling a telegraph key tapping out an endless, unintelligible code into the silent air. He stepped off the porch and into the mud of the clearing. His trumpet horns rotated toward the ravine, sensing the distant rhythmic pulses of the larger vents. He was a node, a mobile antenna for the colossal mine sleeping beneath the roots of the forest. I didn't wait for him to turn back. I dragged myself backward across the porch on my belly, sliding silently through the open door into the pitch-black interior of the barn. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The barn was sealed on 3 sides by heavy corrugated iron sheets and thick timber beams. The dense white spore mist hadn't fully penetrated the interior. It lingered at the door like a reluctant curtain. I backed into a dark corner behind a rusted, abandoned tractor, my knees buckling. I couldn't breathe. My vision was swimming in black spots. The pink filter cartridges on my mask were completely choked with what felt like white mold sucked flat against my face. With trembling, blood-stained fingers, I reached up to the plastic buckles behind my head. I unhooked the straps and pulled the P100 mask off my face. A cold, sharp gasp tore through my throat as I inhaled the air inside the barn. It was stale, tasting heavily of dry straw, rusted iron, and old gasoline, but it was oxygen. I slumped against the tractor's iron wheel, tears of relief leaking down my cheeks, wiping the blood from my lip with the back of my leather glove. My ears buzzed with a loud, ringing silence, the tinnitus of my overstimulated nervous system trying to process the absolute absence of sound. I looked around the shadows of the barn. In the center of the dirt floor sat an old wooden workbench. It was covered in rusted hand tools, dry oil rags, and rotting leather harnesses. But sitting dead center on the wood, dusted in a thin layer of white spore powder, was an ancient olive drab steel box with a heavy canvas strap. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that box. I had seen it in old black and white family photographs, sitting on my grandfather's workbench in Eugene. It was a military issue and /PRC 25 field radio transceiver, a heavy vacuum tube radio built for the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. I scrambled across the dirt on my hands and knees, reaching out to touch the cold steel casing. Stamped into the green paint on the side of the radio, written in black permanent marker that had faded over 40 years, were 3 letters and a date. HS, August 14th, 83. Hiroshi Sanders. My grandfather. He hadn't just been inspecting the mines. He had retreated here, to this exact barn, when the mountain woke up 40 years ago. I reached out and flipped the heavy iron latch on the radio's battery compartment. The metal latch popped open with a dry, stiff snap that sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet gloom of the barn. Inside the radio's compartment wasn't a military battery pack. It had been gutted. In its place, wired directly to the transceiver's internal vacuum tubes with delicate copper threads, sat an old Sony reel-to-reel magnetic tape deck. The small plastic reels were intact. The brown magnetic tape was wound tightly around the left hub, frozen in time for 40 years. Beside the radio lay a leather-bound field journal, its cover white with age and spore dust. I picked it up with trembling, gloved hands and flipped to the final entry, dated August 17, 1983. My grandfather's sharp, precise handwriting stared back at me. It isn't a fungus, and it isn't a disease. It is an ancient acoustic organism, a subterranean neural network that uses 4 Hz infrasound to neutralize the nervous systems of higher predators. It feeds on movement, on voice, on thought. When the timber company cut into the ancient sequoias, they severed its dampening nodes. The network is awake now. It absorbs human consciousness through its root system, using our language, our memories, and our logic to refine its hunting efficiency. I cannot leave the sector. The compass points here because my blood carries the same frequency resonance from my time in the mines. If anyone finds this, do not speak. Do not try to reason with it. It uses your own voice against you. To kill a wave, you must phase invert it. Phase invert it. My mind as an audio engineer raced through the words. In acoustics, destructive interference happens when 2 identical sound waves meet out of phase, 180 degrees opposite each other. The crest of one wave fills the trough of the other. The result isn't a smaller sound. The result is absolute mathematical zero. The network wasn't indestructible. It was a physical sound wave traveling through the air and soil. If I could broadcast a 4 Hz wave flipped at 180 degrees phase inversion at a high enough gain, it would cancel the subterranean signal, shattering the network's control over the air. I looked down at the reel-to-reel deck inside the /PRC 25 radio. My grandfather hadn't just left a journal. He had recorded the inverted wave onto that magnetic tape 40 years ago. He had built the weapon, but he ran out of time before he could transmit it. Connected to the top of the heavy military transceiver was a long, flexible whip antenna that extended upward through a hole in the barn's tin roof, pointing straight at the sky. I flipped the power switch on the /PRC 25. Nothing happened. The vacuum tubes remained dark. The battery was long dead. No, 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 I whispered, my voice cracking in panic. I traced the thick copper-lead wires running out of the radio's power input. They didn't lead to a wall outlet. They stretched across the dirt floor of the barn, disappearing under the rusted chassis of the abandoned tractor in the corner. I crawled over to the tractor, peering beneath the engine block. A heavy-duty 12-volt lead-acid truck battery sat on a wooden crate. It was ancient, its terminals corroded with white lead sulfate crystals, but wrapped around the top was a small, solar-charging trickle panel running out through a gap in the barn's wall. A tiny red indicator light on the battery's casing was flickering dimly. Power. I grabbed the heavy copper alligator clips lying beside the crate and clamped them onto the battery posts. Sparks flew in the dark. Zap. Back at the workbench, the /PRC 25 radio hummed to life. The small amber-glass vacuum tubes inside the metal casing began to glow a warm, fiery orange. The small analog VU meter on the front panel flickered, its needle jumping into the green zone as 40-year-old electronics warmed up. The reel-to-reel tape deck clicked. The small plastic reels began to turn slowly, spinning the brown magnetic tape past the reader head. From the radio's small internal speaker came a faint, crackling hiss of static, followed by the sound of my grandfather's voice, recorded 4 decades ago, preserved in the dark. This is Hiroshi Sanders. If you are hearing this, you are the resonance. Flip the master switch to broadcast. The inverted signal will clear the valley, but the feedback loop will destroy the transmitter. Bang. The barn's front tin wall buckled inward with a deafening, silent crunch. The rusted corrugated metal tore open like paper, showering the dirt floor in sharp iron flakes. Standing in the gap, surrounded by a wall of dense white spore fog, was Miller, and behind him, stepping to the ruined wall, were the two forestry technicians, their eyes glazed white, their mouths stretched wide around those vibrating ivory rootlets. Miller's trumpet horns twitched violently, locking onto the glowing orange light of the vacuum tubes. He didn't rush forward. He slowly raised his hand, pointing his pale, root-laced fingers straight at the reel-to-reel tape spinning on the workbench. From deep inside his hollow chest came my grandfather's voice, mimicked perfectly, projected through his ruined jaw. "Maya, put the tape down," joined the silence. The sound of my grandfather's voice coming from Miller's ruined throat hit me like a physical punch. It was identical in tone, pitch, and cadence, a hollow copy extracted from 40-year-old memories absorbed beneath the mountain. "Maya, put the tape down," joined the silence. The three figures stepped into the barn together, their movements synchronized down to the millisecond. Behind them, through the torn corrugated iron wall, the white spore fog surged into the building like a breaking wave. The pale, trumpet-shaped vents on the ravine floor outside were all leaning toward the barn, vibrating at maximum amplitude. The 4 hertz infrasound wave spiked to an agonizing level. The air inside the barn compressed so hard my vision went black at the edges. Blood gushed fresh from my nose, running down my neck, soaking the collar of my torn jacket. The wooden workbench rattled against the dirt floor. The rusted tools jumped and danced on the boards. Flipped the master switch to broadcast. My grandfather's instructions echoed inside my skull, fighting through a thick, nauseating vertigo, pulling me toward the dirt. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't try to run. I lunged across the workbench, throwing my full body weight over the glowing green chassis of the military radio. Miller moved. He didn't sprint. He glided forward, his pale hand reaching out, his root-laced fingers extended to snap my neck before I could touch the controls. The female technician swung her heavy brass pipe wrench in a wide, silent arc toward my skull. My fingers slammed into the cold, heavy toggle switch on the front panel of the /PRC 25. I threw the switch from local to broadcast. Click. The vacuum tubes inside the radio burst into an intense, blinding blue light. The 180-degree phase inverted wave stored on the magnetic tape didn't travel through the air as a loud roar. It expanded outward as a violent mathematical anti-signal, a destructive sonic shockwave that collided head-on with the mountain's 4 hertz pulse. When two identical waves meet out of phase, they do not create noise. They erase it. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The dense, suffocating pressure inside my skull vanished instantly, as if a tight steel band around my brain had been snapped. The heavy, oily weight in the air dissolved. My ears popped with sharp, clear crack, and for the first time in 24 hours, the natural world came crashing back. I heard the howling wind off the Cascades roaring to the torn tin roof. I heard the sharp, frantic rattle of loose iron sheets. I heard the dry fir trees groaning in the gale outside. The three hosts froze in mid-stride, the pale white rootlets pushing out their throats, eyes, and jaws then just stopped vibrating. They exploded under the mathematical violence of the inverted signal. The cellular structure of the mycelium disintegrated into a fine, dry powder. The white trumpet horns on Miller's face burst into clouds of pale dust that blew away in the mountain wind. Karen dropped her pipe wrench. It hit the dirt floor with a loud, metallic clang that echoed off the timber rafters. She collapsed backward into the dust, motionless, as the white fungal growth covering her skin shriveled and turned to black ash. Miller fell to his knees. The fungal mass fusing his jaw to his chest split open, releasing a long, final gust of stale air before he slumped forward onto his face, still and silent. Outside the barn, down in the ravine, a series of wet, muffled thuds echoed to the dirt as dozens of the fleshy trumpet vents collapsed into gray slime. The /PRC 25 radio on the workbench was glowing red hot. The vacuum tubes were melting inside their glass envelopes, the copper wiring smoking and sparking as a massive feedback loop destroyed the 40-year-old transmitter, just as my grandfather had warned. The plastic reels on the Sony tape deck melted into a sticky, black pool of resin, the magnetic tape burning away into a wispy curl of gray smoke. With a final, sharp pop, the radio went dark. Silence returned to the barn, but it was no longer the suffocating, unnatural vacuum of the network. It was just the quiet of an old wooden building sitting in the Oregon wilderness, listening to the wind blow through the trees. I lay on the dirt floor beside the dead radio, gasping for air, clutching my broken shoulder. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust, and dry blood caked on my face. I looked out through the torn wall of the barn. The thick white spore mist was dispersing rapidly, torn apart by the mountain breeze, floating away into blue afternoon sky like ordinary morning fog. Down in the basin, the ancient sequoias stood tall, copper-barked, and still. They were just trees again. I dragged myself up onto my feet, using the edge of the workbench for support. I didn't look back at the bodies on the floor. I stumbled out through the ruined tin wall into the cool, sharp mountain air. I walked down the ravine, sliding through the mud, stepping over the rotting, shriveled remains of the fungal vents. It took me 3 hours to reach the old logging road, my boots dragging to the dirt, my mind completely numb. A state trooper found me sitting on a stump at the side of the highway near Deep Creek Bridge at sunset. They took me to the hospital in Klamath Falls. I spent 2 weeks in isolation. The official Forest Service report listed the incident as an acute exposure to a rare, toxic spore bloom triggered by the previous year's fire, combined with severe dehydration and trauma. They closed Sector 4 permanently, declaring the Deep Creek Basin a restricted ecological hazard zone behind 12-foot chain-link fences. They think it's over. I live in a small apartment in downtown Seattle now, as far away from the forests of the Pacific Northwest as I can get. I kept my grandfather's leather journal, but I threw his compass into the Puget Sound. I don't go to parks. I don't listen to music on headphones, because every now and then, when the city grows quiet late at night, when the traffic dies down and the wind blows hard off the ocean, I can press my ear flat against the concrete floor of my apartment. Deep down, miles beneath the asphalt, the pipes, and the bedrock, I can feel a faint, rhythmic vibration. 4 hertz. It's not dead. It's just waiting for someone else to cut into the roots.